There are moments in history that don't seem like much at the time. No crowds, no spotlight, no sense that anything world-changing was about to happen. Sometimes the reality behind the lore is far more complicated than we were ever taught. It was the spring of 1775, and tensions had been growing among the American colonies. It started quiet at first and then grew louder. Disagreements over taxes, military, authority, control. What started as frustration was turning quickly into something else, something much sharper. In Boston, the British redcoats had become a constant presence. There were redcoats just walking around the street, ships all over the harbor, and it was a reminder every single day of who was in charge. But outside the city, something was forming. Militia groups, local networks, men who weren't soldiers, yet anyway, but who were ready to be if needed. They stored supplies like their weapons, gunpowder, and shot, and they kept it just outside of Boston, just in case. Now the thing is, the British knew this, or at least suspected it, so plans were made quietly. Troops would just march undercover in darkness and move quickly, and their goal was to seize all of these supplies before the militias could react. But in times like these, secrets just don't stay secret for long. Among those people was a silversmith, a craftsman, a man who moved easily between worlds, business, politics, and something in between. His name, of course, was Paul Revere. Paul, of course, wasn't a soldier just yet, but he understood what was coming, and more importantly, he knew what needed to be done. If the British marched, the countryside had to know, and they had to know fast. We all know the story. A lone rider, a midnight dash, a warning shouted into the dark that would spark an entire revolution. But there's just one problem. That story's just a little bit too clean-cut. The man that you think you know, the silversmith turned patriot, wasn't just a rider. He was something far more dangerous. Long before that night, he'd already embedded a network. No official army or organization. It was more like a web of merchants, patriots, tradesmen, blue-collar workers, everyday people. People who could move the information faster than any marching column. Paul didn't just carry the messages himself. He helped build the system that made the messages matter. There were signals, routes, and contingencies. And yes, even the famous lantern signal, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. But that wasn't even his idea. He delegated that out to somebody else. This wasn't about one man writing, it was about coordination. On the night that everybody remembers and history tells us, he didn't set out alone, not even close. There were actually multiple riders that were dispatched all across the countryside, each with overlapping routes, kind of like an insurance against failure. So if one got captured, another would get through. And capture was actually a very real possibility because British patrols weren't asleep, they were already on the move. In fact, partway through Paul Revere's ride, he got caught. He was surrounded, questioned, and detained, and the legend says that he outran the British, but reality says he didn't, at least not on that night. He was intercepted before even reaching his final destination. His horse was taken, his mission was completely interrupted. So how did the warning spread? Well, by then it didn't matter anymore. The network had already done its job. Actually, there were other riders who are less remembered and less celebrated throughout history, but they carried the messages farther and faster, and in some cases, more effectively than Paul could. Most of the men's names barely even made it into the textbooks. A few did. Men like Samuel Prescott, who slipped past the British and continued to ride when the others couldn't. But history has a way of oversimplifying things, or of taking this complicated web and turning it into just a single thread or narrative, and that thread just gets polished decade after decade throughout time. This one wasn't done by witnesses or soldiers, but by a poet. Nearly 90 years after the event, a poet was written that would cement the story into the public imagination. A poem that needed a hero or a central figure. It needed a clean narrative. Talk about your main character energy. So the story was reshaped, compressed, refined. One writer, one mission, one unforgettable night. And just like that, an entire network became just one man. But that still doesn't even tell the whole story, because the man himself, the one at the center of it all, wasn't even just a courier of the warnings. Paul wasn't just an engraver, he was a propagandist. He crafted some of the most influential images of the time, and these images were designed not just to inform others, but to provoke and to stir anger, and to help shape opinion. In my mind, I kind of see him as like an OG Banksy. One of his most famous works depicted the American colonists against the British soldiers. It wasn't entirely accurate. Actually, he exaggerated a lot of the details and composed his work very carefully. He did this because the truth wasn't always the point, the impact was. Paul understood something that most people didn't at the time, and that's that war wasn't always fought with just weapons. They were fought with stories. And Paul was very, very good at telling stories. After the war, he didn't fade into legendary status right away. He just went back to work and built his business. He expanded into manufacturing, becoming in many ways an early industrialist. He wasn't just a writer or a patriot, but a builder, a connector, a man who lived in the space between tradesman and revolutionary. And here's where legend and reality blur one last time, because the ride that you remember wasn't the start of anything, it was the continuation. The continuation of something already in motion. Plans had been laid, warnings anticipated. The countryside wasn't caught off guard and alerted by one writer. It was already ready. So maybe this story isn't about just one midnight ride. It's about something quieter and much more powerful. Preparation, coordination, and the kind of influence that doesn't have to be shouted to be heard. Because by the time Paul was stopped that night, the message had already outrun him. And that is the part that was omitted.